the International Energy Agency made some news this week for what it put in its World Energy Outlook, and then today with its release of the oil market report. And on Monday, we'll have Antoine Haff, who heads the oil market division at the International Energy Agency, here to talk about how the IEA views the U.S. oil market. Key to a lot of that is what's happening in Turkey and everything around Turkey. So you can't really talk about the global energy picture without talking about Caspian pipelines, Eastern Mediterranean gas, the oil production outlook in Iraq, what's happening in Iran, and whether that oil will come back to the market, and the key role that Turkey plays as a hub for all of that activity, not to mention its own domestic energy challenges in terms of its forecasts for demand growth, impact on greenhouse gas emissions, and everything else. So I'm really delighted that Memduh Karakullukcu could be here today. He's the vice chairman and president of the Global Relations Forum, a managing partner at Croton Consulting. He's been a great friend of the Center on Global Energy Policy in our short history, working with us through the Global Center in Istanbul. That is one of the 8 global centers that Columbia University has around the world, and was really kind enough. They have you'll see on the table over there, and absolutely, it's probably the best thing out there for people who want to understand the energy picture in Turkey. And so I hope people will make a point of reading it if you haven't already. And so I'm really delighted that he could be here today to talk a little bit about the report, talk a little bit about the regional energy picture in Turkey and the surrounding neighborhood, and then we can have a conversation about it. And Professor Cooley is going to make a few remarks and response afterwards, and then we'll have a time for Q&A and a discussion. So please join me in welcoming Memduh to Columbia. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. Good morning. What a great pleasure to be back here in New York, Columbia. When I was coming here this morning, I recalled the anxiety that I felt every day coming up here when I was a law student. Because, believe it or not, it's just, I don't miss being a student. So I think, the best of luck to those who are still students. Of course, anxiety never goes away. Here I am professing to know something about energy, regional energy, Turkish energy. The domain of energy is so vast and so dynamic that I think it's virtually impossible to keep up with the new reserves, the pipeline deals that are agreed on and then canceled, and then again agreed on, the never-ending nuclear debates with tens of countries discussing the possibility of nuclear plans, and of course the never-ceasing good news, followed by bad news, followed by good news, again on new technologies that can address our enormous climate changes. And here I am professing to know something about all these developments. That is audacious. I was cramming early this morning. I woke up early just to make sure that I know anything and everything that was any news about what's happening. And believe it or not, there is news about the TANAP process going from Azerbaijan to Europe. And then there is, of course, developments about the Iraqi pipelines, the KRG pipeline. So it's amazing. It literally, on a daily basis, there are new developments. So I think I should confess I'm almost as anxious about being in front of you as I was before a Socratic grilling at the law school, given the context. Before I start my remarks, let me thank the Columbia Global Energy Center and, of course, Jason for inviting me. I observe from afar the amazing dynamism of this center, which happened in a very short period of time. It feels like every morning I receive an invitation to an event at the Global Energy Center, and I congratulate everyone involved for the energy that goes into that. My remarks today reflect some of the findings of the GRF Task Force report, which you can find on the table. Just to situate the whole thing for you, GRF is a membership association bringing together leaders in business, academia, government to think about the key items on the global agenda. The purpose is to contribute to Turkey's efforts to be a constructive actor in the global scene, and also to contribute to Turkey's policymaking. And our key instrument is the task forces, where we bring together some of our members, talk about these issues for a year, then we come up, we draft a report and everybody undersigns it. Getting that in Turkey anywhere in the world is never easy, but it happens. So in a nutshell, that is GRF, and we work through these task forces mainly. We do a lot of other things as well, but I won't get into that. Let me now get back to energy. Now, there is, as I said, a lot happening on the ground, and I really would like to get back to that during the Q&A. But let me step back and give a sort of a more conceptual, broader picture. And I'll start with just making 3 general points about the purpose and where this whole analysis is taking us. The first one is, although the report is on Turkey's energy policies, the underlying purpose is broader. As I said, we're trying to make a contribution to the global agenda. So the framework looks at Turkey's problems in more abstract terms that can be applicable if you look at other national energy problems, other national contexts. When you try to model the global energy problem or any global problem, one way is to think of the global ideal. So how should energy be produced and consumed if this was just one community, one nation, one globe? And then you can say, since these are the objectives and these are the ways to get there, the policies more or less should be applied across different nations. So then you can give advice to national policymakers to act accordingly. That could be one approach. Alternatively, you can start more realistically, by modeling the optimum strategy of nations, how they look at the picture, and given the constraints, what they're doing, and then aggregate and see why you diverge from the global optimum, and see if there are any systemic reasons why these nations diverge from the global optimum, and then try to address those global systemic constraints. That is the alternative. The national to global, start from the national, go to global, is more tedious. That we know. But I think that is our best bet because the world is still governed by nation states. And I am actually the product of the global to national policy school because I was educated in the US in the era of the Washington Consensus when we looked at the world economically and financially and then said, these are the right policies, so on and so forth. But I think we failed on a few fronts. And, I remember vividly thinking that we need to imagine a world of compatible heterogeneity across nations rather than the policy uniformity that was the sort of the trend at the time. Actually, I think the aha moment when I realized that we should start from nation states go up was during one of my seminars at Columbia Law School with Ambassador Gardner at CEPA. And I think that was actually one of the reasons why I ended up going home. In that context, I think it's important to note that the goal was to figure out the rational Turkish energy strategy, but doing it in a way that will allow us to identify these systemic problems that I mentioned. Now, hopefully, I'll be going around the world with that concept set to see whether other nations have similar systemic problems that make them diverge from the global optimum. The second point I want to make is that thinking about these policies in the energy context is really only a small part of the work because the context changes. And if you want your policy advice to remain relevant for 5-10 years, really you need to go sort of to a meta level, to an abstract level. Because otherwise it's, the advice you give for the next 3 months may not be applicable when the context changes. The problem with abstract policy advice is that it can be abstract. It needs to be deciphered, decoded to the immediate policy advice. And somebody has to do that work as well. And that is where institutions come in. So I think, what we try to do in the report, as we try to extend the horizon to 5-10 years, having these sort of long-term policy visions and propositions, we complemented them with institutions that can decode and decipher them. And I think really institutions like the Global Energy Center are very useful in that context. They are precious, they're indispensable. I don't know how you describe the mission, I didn't look at the mission, but I think translating long-term policy thinking to short-term policy action or testing short-term policies against long-term policy goals is a crucial intellectual role. The third point I want to make, it's actually a nice segue into the findings of the report. National policy debates typically use diversification as the general paradigm to guide energy policy. So we say, have more infrastructure, have more suppliers, get gas from as many countries as you can, so on and so forth, or even diversify between gas and nuclear and then bring in coal and, just so that you have many alternatives. The problem is, it's a very useful concept. Needless to say. The problem is, from a security perspective, diversification's utility is more questionable in many contexts. Energy sources or infrastructures are frequently lumpy, and they're not substitutable. So if there is a disruption in one of those sources, the odds are your diversification will not allow you to replace it with something else. And if that is the case, diversification is really not the solution. I mean, we get gas from Russia, 60%, 20%, I mean, these numbers fluctuate, but, and roughly 20% from Iran. So, if you have 5% nuclear, that is not going to solve the security problem. So one needs to make sure that diversification, it comes from actually, I think, as far as I know, from financial markets. That's where I learned about it. And when I get into the theory of it, you need more granular risks when you want to talk about this. If you have these lumpy problems and you lose one and you're out in the open, it's a different problem set. And in that, I think one should be talking about creating options of redundancies, of scalability. When an opportunity arises, the ability to shift strategies at very short notice. It's a different, the diversification is one set of policies, but then I think the option-based sort of scalability, redundancy set is another conceptual sort of policy tool set that we need and I think we should use. In the report, we do try to distinguish between these risks and discontinuities, as we call them, that require these optionalities. Now let me try to illustrate some of these ideas in the Turkish context. Turkey, mid-sized nation, some call it big, some call it not so big, but I think it's fair to say it's mid-sized. And it has about 1.1% of the global population, generates roughly 1.1% of the global economic value. So we're just, we are just there. It accounts for 0.9% of global energy consumption. And as of 2011, its primary supply of energy is 90% from fossil fuels. And the global average is around 81, 82. So we are about 10%, 8, 9, 10% higher than the world average in our fossil fuel dependence. Our electricity is roughly half generated from natural gas. It's actually 44%, a quarter from coal, and a quarter from hydro. Again, you have 1-2% renewables, so on and so forth. This is very rough because otherwise, one doesn't remember precise numbers, but if you say half, quarter, that's how I remember it. There's no nuclear power generation at the moment, but plans are underway to start nuclear generation by the end of the decade. Turkey has very limited indigenous oil or gas sources. We do have low-quality lignite reserves. We've imported 94% of oil needs and 98% of its gas. Effectively, you can call Turkey imports all its oil and gas needs. It's a country that depends on fossil fuels for its energy consumption, and it relies on imports, especially in oil and gas. And in oil markets, it uses 0.8% of global consumption and can source its supplies from anywhere, obviously, in the international markets. But mostly we get our oil from the region. We happen to have neighbors who have a lot of oil. So in gas markets, we are actually more region-bound. So in oil markets, we do have the flexibility at the end of the day. But in gas markets, not really. Because about 90% of our gas is pipeline delivered. And it is, as I said, Russia, Iran, and Azerbaijan constitute it, basically. Those are the three. And 60%, which does fluctuate, is from Russia, 20% from Iran, 10% from Azerbaijan. This should give you an idea of magnitudes. Precise numbers do change among years, but that's roughly the magnitude. Russia is the big supplier. And Iran is indispensable. We cannot substitute it. So those are the main things to remember. And it is an important transit country. In 2010, about 6% of global oil trade was realized through the Bosphorus, and also the pipelines that cross Turkey from Azerbaijan and from Iraq. So we do have 6% of traded oil is actually quite significant. So we can say Turkey is a transit country in oil. But it is really not a gas transit country yet. I think there is the misconception places I go that it already is. It isn't. It is an aspiring gas transit country. There's a very small exception. We do, through us, there's a small sort of sale to Greece, but that does not qualify us as a gas transit country. But it is potentially a critical gas transit country for Azeri gas, Iraqi, Turkmen, Eastmed, or even at some point Iranian gas. So we have a fast-growing, mid-sized country that's heavily reliant on imported fossil fuels, strategically reliant on its neighbors, Russia and Iran, for pipeline-delivered gas that cannot be replaced in case of a disruption, and it harbors great aspirations for becoming a main transit or hub country that would, of course, also feed its own increasing demand for energy. So that's the picture. So that's roughly the picture. And it is in that context one needs to think about this Turkish energy policy, energy strategy. Let me address the possible discontinuities, because if we get into the uncertainties and how to deal with that, that's a whole different game. So let me talk about these big issues. First, about fossil fuels. I mean, that's our main concern. 90%, that we depend on that. Given the overwhelming reliance, there's a knee-jerk impulse to reduce dependence on fossil fuels. But to the extent that these new sources like nuclear or renewables do not generate adequate redundancies, fossil fuel supply security will remain our primary concern. When we talk about energy, that will be the issue. In thinking about fossil fuels, in the report, we argue that the meta variable that shapes and should shape strategic national thinking is really the market structure of these fuels. To the extent that the markets function well, the energy problem is really a risk diversification issue. So, can you get it from the right people at the right cost? Can you have your national energy bill under control? It really is an economic issue. But if the market is fragmented, it's regionally determined, and you depend on your neighbors for the supplies, it really is a different problem. Then you get in the game of bilateral interdependencies, because as I said, you cannot substitute them with somebody else. So that creates a whole other set of issues unrelated to actually energy trade and energy economics. You get into politics because it's an integral part of it. You need to make sure that you have this whole relation with Iran and Russia that can harbor, that can accommodate this energy interdependence. That is what I mean by discontinuous context, when you rely on the binomial decision of a supplier country and there is no middle ground. I mean, if they cut it, you're out there in the open. There really is no solution. Those kinds of risks create, as I said, major distortions. Now, we are at an interesting point in history where the market structure of these two commodities, mainly gas, may be qualitatively shifting. In oil, the possibility of a shift is small, but I think it is present. I mean, I do insist on this point. I think it is a small possibility. It needs to be addressed. The Chinese demand for oil supply security is a fact. I mean, we know that. They care about this. And then, now over the last few years, for a variety of reasons, there is intense talk about US supply independence. Those coming from two big actors in the global scene, saying that they care about their sort of national supply security and independence and creating mechanisms and regional access guarantees, it becomes sort of a different picture when you look at it from a nation like Turkey's perspective. Because that means, fast forward, if the big actors, the big consumers, start focusing on creating mechanisms to guarantee supplies that go beyond the market, that would be a different game. The global oil market would be very different. Again, the odds are it will not happen, but just the talk of it, immediately, again, for a country like Turkey, when you start strategically thinking about it, yes, it won't happen in the 5 years, but if it does happen in 20 years, and the oil markets become, regionally separated to some degree, starting with price divergence, so on and so forth, you should, even if it's a 1% possibility, you should start thinking about a hedge. What is your hedge? What do you do? And then again, we get into the game of creating regional interdependency. So you start thinking about, even if, oil markets start faltering, we can at least get our oil from Iraq. So let's make sure that the Iraqi relation reflects that it becomes that kind of a relation. It's a hedge. In case things don't work out, we'll know that we have our Iraqi friends and others around the region where we can sort of mutually benefit and survive this change. If a country like Turkey and others start thinking in those terms, then that is how you start getting the whole structure getting sort of coagulating into separate pieces. Low probability, but that is either explicitly or implicitly part of the thinking. You cannot avoid that. I mean, you know, as I said, it's independent of the probability. It does, you can say, poison, or it can inform the thinking process, at least in parts of the world that I know about. Now, for gas, the evolution is in the opposite direction. The world appears to be moving from regionally separated markets to, roughly global markets, thanks to shale and LNG. That's a welcome shift, as that would eliminate these political constraints and the distortions I talked about. And in the Turkish context, of course, political and security, as I said, calculations are determined by these distortions. To the extent that we get these natural gas markets functioning, then we can go to the diversification paradigm, which is, you know, as I said, healthier, and people can start thinking less about these political issues. And now the risk assessments will change. If we have reliable gas markets, the outlook on alternatives, so you look at gas, if natural gas comes from diversified global markets where you can substitute, and you have these LNG facilities where you can do it, if you think you can get gas whenever and wherever you want, then your outlook on coal and nuclear changes. I mean, that's why this whole energy scene is so integrated. Because if you feel you can get reliably gas for a long time to come, then maybe you wouldn't bother with nuclear. Or you would think that the climate harms of coal is simply not worth it because you already have a relatively reliable source of energy. So these things are very important. Creating these globally integrated and globally accessible energy markets is critical in addressing many of these other systemic problems like climate change, like the risks of nuclear. That is why when I started saying, you know, let's start from the national, go up to the global, that is what I was trying to get at. Sort of, you look at the national, the concern is, I need to get my gas reliably. If I can't, I will think about coal, I will think about nuclear, and that's just the way it is. So if we need to move from the global separation, fragmentation to integration, that will, I think, change the calculus for many countries. Now, let me say a few words about new energy technologies. For me, for us, that includes renewables, efficiency technologies, as well as clean carbon technologies. So funny enough, I mean, we group them together because we think they're more or less similar in the sense that they're technology policy issues, they're technology investments. They more or less, all of them have very high upfront investments, and then, you know, they sort of work through. So in some sense, the technology problem, if there is the fossil fuel, which I talked about there, that's one area, then the new energy technologies is the other sort of area that a national strategic thinking, policy thinking should focus on. Again, the national strategy seems to diverge from the global optimum when thinking about national new energy technologies. Now, given the uncertainty surrounding various technologies, especially regarding the cost curves, because we don't really know how fast the cost curves of solar, offshore wind, geothermal will come down, that creates a huge uncertainty. Okay, from, again, a national perspective. The problem, I think, is, again, it doesn't lend itself to proper diversification, because these technologies, as I said, they have very discontinuous timing and discontinuous cost functions. The odds are one or two of these technologies will improve rapidly and then will be ready for scaling up. If a country, like mine, is simply a consumer of these technologies, so we look at these technologies, they're just coming online, and I mean, they're sort of advancing, the more rational strategy, unfortunately, appears to be waiting it out. So we wait until the point when one of these technologies is ready to go, it's competitive, and the one thing, of course, we should do, this is the optionality, create the grids and the smart grids and the infrastructure such that when the technology is available, we can scale up in a short period of time. That seems to be the wiser strategy. Rather than saying, yeah, it's expensive, we'll subsidize it, let's get in there. If you are just a consumer of these technologies, that doesn't really make it. That doesn't do it in these policy discussions. What is interesting, though, in our deliberations, it became obvious that the new energy technologies is not only an energy issue. It's also an industrial policy discussion. Because those in Turkey or elsewhere who are in favor of these new technologies, mostly their incentives is actually economic. They think Turkey can be a stakeholder in some part of these new energy technologies going forward when they boom globally. If we invest now, if we get in the game now, we'll actually get a share of the economic value creation. So it's the industrial policy dimension of it that motivates countries like Turkey to invest in these. Not the energy consumption and the climate dimension. It is the other one. It's creating economic value. Now, although that should also give us an idea. So basically, you have a country like Turkey where the simple energy policy does not justify in investing or deploying new energy technologies, but we know that to achieve the global climate targets, we do need all countries to get in the game. And the only way to do it, it seems, to convince countries like Turkey that they can be stakeholders, that they will be stakeholders in the global value chains around these new energy technologies. So if systematically, again, we can around the globe create a business environment, a legal environment, a trading environment where these sort of contenders for new energy technologies feel they can be a part of it, then I think that will change the attitude at the national level, and the divergence between the national policy and the global goal will probably narrow. That's a second important point. And finally, let me turn to nuclear. Nuclear is a tricky issue. We all know that. At the global level, the main argument in favor of nuclear is carbon emissions. But the downside is the safety security dimension. That is a problem. And if so many new countries as planned get in the game, the risk is probably increasing that there will be a security or a safety failure somewhere. We have not had the security crisis version of Fukushima yet, but nuclear catastrophes can happen as a result of destructive human intent, just as they can happen due to natural events like tsunami. I have spent the last 2 days up in Cambridge thinking and talking about these possibilities, and it is just worrying to say the least. So nuclear basically puts the global climate risk against the global nuclear catastrophe risk. And by the way, this is why energy is never easy. It seems to interlink with everything. You know, you start from energy, you start thinking about and getting worried about everything. So what is the national approach to nuclear? Turkish national strategy is to achieve 5% of power generation from nuclear by 2020 to 2023, around there. Probably, I mean, given the current plans, we may just go over the 5%, and then we'll increase it from there. Turkey has already agreed with Russian suppliers for 4 reactors, 4,800 megawatts nuclear capacity, and recently signed an agreement with the Japanese consortium for around 5,000 megawatts. The details, as far as I know, are not clear yet. And there's already talk about the third one. Now, there are legitimate arguments for and against nuclear, but they require close scrutiny, which should have relevance for everyone. The energy security dimension, as I said, is not straightforward unless you can create capacity with nuclear that can replace your main supplier. The security problem is not really, it doesn't go away. It's there. Maybe you partially remove it, but it is there. I mean, if, 10% you rely, unsubstitutably for 10% on a supplier and they cut it, again, 10% of your population is in trouble. So I think the more interesting argument is economic, and it's about reducing the volatility of the energy bill. A very important characteristic of nuclear, as we all know, is that you pay upfront. It is the technology investment that's the cost of nuclear. The fuel itself, compared to gas and coal, is relatively a very small part of the overall cost of nuclear energy. Now, given that cost structure, if you invest in nuclear, you basically lock in the cost of a part of your energy bill. So if you think about an energy portfolio, I do see the point that having one sort of a fixed cost or a locked-in cost together with these variable costs, it does make sense. It does reduce the overall volatility of your bill, and I think it makes sense, and that is a fair argument. The argument that just to focus on the variable costs and saying that nuclear fuel is so much cheaper than gas and coal obviously is ridiculous, but you do hear it in the discourse around nuclear. But still, as I said, there's a legitimate argument there. And when the other one that comes up is the current account deficits issue that if you get nuclear, since you'll be generating your own energy, you address the current account deficit, the trade deficit. That doesn't really add up either. That needs to be scrutinized much more closely, because at the end of the day, if the technology, the upfront cost is not yours, it's not your technology, and you're not generating it, then at some point you will, as either through feed tariffs or other mechanisms, you will pay for that technology. So instead of paying for the gas, you will be paying for the technology. Of course, the issue is, can you actually get a large chunk of the investment, be it the construction, undertaken by your local firms, in which case it would have an impact. But that should be the discussion. What percentage of the investment is from local sources? And of course, the climate argument is the most relevant one. As I said, there are sound and not so sound arguments in the national debates around nuclear. The divergence of the national strategy from the global can emerge in assessing the global security and investing in the mechanisms to alleviate that risk. I think that is the main problem. The divergence comes from how we value and internalize the global security risk of nuclear. It is critical for any nuclear power state to look at this technology at a global scale, because most countries, I think, I don't know if mine, I should put it under that group, but I could, to some extent. The focus is on the generation, the national energy generation from nuclear. But the downside of nuclear, the risk aspect of nuclear, is global. So if a crisis occurs in another part of the world, be it safety, security, it does have implications for you. So you cannot really, when you're looking at this problem, you cannot separate the global risk context from your calculations. And I think that separation is creating a divergence in the calculations of many new national aspiring countries for nuclear power. Because if you really think about the global risk context and price it in, the picture may look different. And the second thing is, even if at the end of that analysis you think, fine, this is good, then it follows that you should do all in your power intellectually and institutionally to invest in global security and safety. So any new aspiring power in nuclear has to invest in global nuclear safety and security. That is one of the, I think, important conclusions of the report. Let me wrap up. All in all, I want to leave you with the main theme that if we want to achieve global objectives in energy and climate, we need to understand national calculations and constraints carefully and build global policies accordingly. Ensuring global markets in fossil fuels, ensuring that all countries are stakeholders, investors, and consumers in new energy technologies, and ensuring that all nuclear power states invest in global nuclear safety, security contexts, I think are in the interest of the world as a whole. If there are divergences from these global norms, we need to establish the systemic reasons at the national level and start solving them systematically at the global level. I will do my part going around the world, taking to various institutions to understand how they compare with our energy outlook. But I think the Global Energy Center is the ideal venue. I mean, I'm just going around coming from one country. This is the ideal platform for talking about and comparing the national experiences. I'm sure under Jason's leadership, the center will inform us all about the common themes, concerns, and structural constraints that determine and arguably distort national policies. It is a timely enterprise, and we are already benefiting from it. Thank you for the vision and the great execution. I will conclude by saying that please do enjoy this great resource, enjoy this great university, and of course, enjoy this great city. It's great to be back. Thank you very much.
Wow, that was really something. I feel like I'm back in the classroom, right? Which is a great feeling. What a treat. Thank you very much for this invitation. It's a pleasure to meet you. Pleasure to read some of these writings. And I, my own background is I'm a political scientist, international relations theorist. I study Eurasia. That's my main scene, so to speak. So I certainly can't comment on a lot of the nuance and the richness in the presentation, but I can perhaps comment a little bit on how political science and our approaches have informed, or I would argue misinformed, policymaking attitudes to some of these changes that are going on. And I really appreciated a couple of things, meta things in your report. One was this idea of getting away from the platitude of diversification. As far as reports go, this is a report that doesn't have a lot of platitudes, right? And political scientists really enjoy those. And the way that you break that down, talking about, yes, diversification, that's only one piece of it. And actually, as you drill down to the regional level, that makes less sense. And I'm particularly also taken by your comments at the end, not just about the opportunities of emerging powers, as Turkey is, and middling powers, but also their obligations in both the nuclear issue and the investments in new technologies. That strikes me as something that travels to other areas, Brazil, Mexico, other similar types of positioned countries. So I really do think there is a lot of comparative value in this report, and I learned a lot from it. I just want to briefly flag what I think are kind of three sort of main perspectives that a political scientist would use to view sort of energies or Turkey's current strategizing about energy and how it fits within the overall region. The first is the pure geopolitics approach. And this is something that we've used a lot. There are good reasons for this, right? Once pipelines are built, and states commit to them, they create facts on the ground, they create relationships and so forth. Energy is tied to issues of security, it's tied to bilateral relationships and all sorts of different sort of strategic factors. But I also think the geopolitics has been taken too far in the Eurasian context, and especially on both the Western and the Russian side and some of the related countries, that we started justifying a lot of our policies, invoking the geopolitical meme of energy security and energy supply almost at every turn. I think it's a really interesting time to look back at BTC in this perspective and ask ourselves, Baku, Tbilisi, Ceyhan, this pipeline, this monumental pipeline, just how significant was it? How significant was it economically? How significant was it politically? But what were the unintended consequences of it over the long term? And I think one of the unintended consequences is that it got us thinking very much in terms of geopolitical competition, especially in terms of looking at Russia and what should Western policies be via Russia, how should the West address Europe's energy security and so forth. I think BTC has unintentionally informed a lot of this thinking, and I would argue not in a very productive way. So I think geopolitics has its purpose, but it also has its limits. Much more intriguing are a couple of other emerging perspectives. I'm going to try and defend political science, right? And one would be, I think, a bargaining and contracting approach, where relative power in negotiations and political imperatives flow not from the geopolitical orientation of states, but rather the specific relational power within that contract itself, right? And I think the natural gas industry sector is an area where you see this a lot, where you have huge outlays in terms of sort of fixed investments. Once pipelines are constructed, they become facts on the ground where you don't have a natural market. And so this creates a couple of imperatives. One is both suppliers and consumers want to readily find alternatives to increase their bargaining leverage in these interactions. B, there's the possibility of holdup and spoilers in this, disagreements over price. Transit countries can be spoilers here too, which I think is quite important. That is, it's not just the threat of suppliers sort of cutting off, it's all the countries sort of in between that potentially add to what Williamson calls, Oliver Williamson, the holdup. So that necessitates different types of institutional arrangements. So it creates the paradox where Russia, that in general does not favor Western order types of international institutions on issues and intends to be revisionist, is appealing to the EU to place Ukrainian transit security under an institutional structure. That's a very kind of Williamsonian finding about hierarchy and institutions and the problems that stem from these types of structures. Then I think your point is really critical here. We take this perspective that if we take seriously the technological change in the form of shale and LNG, is going to create this integrated market structure, then in essence what that does is it creates substitutability out of relations that were once relationally specific. And I think that has huge political implications that we can think through again in that model. The third perspective is the one that you don't hear as much about, but really got me thinking, which I would say is sort of a more sociological perspective on outlooks. And I would say Rawi Abdullah at Harvard Business School has just published a very good paper in the Review of International Political Economy on conventions and European energy security. Really offers a lot of food for thought here. When he talks about beyond the politics, beyond the economics, energy security in the energy sector is characterized by high degrees of uncertainty. And what do actors do in high degrees of uncertainty? They rely on conventions. They rely on their ideological orientations. They rely on previous types of relationships that they have confidence in. And for Abdullah, this explains the disjuncture between the imperatives of the EU and the Commission and the talk about European energy security and the actual behavior of German, Italian, and French firms. Abdullah's point is that especially German firms and Italian firms value and feel very comfortable with their relationship with Russia, and that this explains both South Stream and Nord Stream decisions going against directives from Brussels and so forth. He reminds us that conventions create frames, but they also lock us in. And I was particularly thinking about this in terms of how we label, how we classify things. And this, I guess, would be my one point of not criticism, but just engagement. I'd like to hear your thoughts. I'm wondering whether the whole Turkey as a transit hub isn't becoming a convention. And whether the whole kind of orienting strategy of Turkey as this hub, as this sort of center, perhaps doesn't even cut against some of the nuanced policies that you're talking about. I can imagine the status that Turkey might have as a convention might complicate new agreements, either with northern Iraq or on possible new agreements with Cyprus and Israel and so forth. Whether there's a cost to labeling yourself in that way because people want to take away that label, right? Or people are threatened by it, and it doesn't allow the kind of strategic, nuanced thinking that you're talking about. So I would just throw that out, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. So yes, geopolitics is important, but market structure and bargaining power is important. Conventions are important, and one final point I'd like to make is just the timing of all of these things. When we think about where we were, and maybe again this speaks to the paucity of our policymaking discourse about European energy security in 2007 and the concerns that we have, and we look at the picture now, 6 years later, Gazprom's monopoly is completely broken, but not by the West, it's by the East, right? CNPC has set up a complete distribution and production hub around Central Asia. We've had a regional war that actually didn't seem to do much in terms of overall disruptions of sort of energy supply. We've had long-term contracts renegotiated in Europe itself. In other words, the urgency that we had on this purely geopolitical level is not what it used to be. It doesn't mean that the issues still aren't there, but just so many technological, geopolitical, economic things have happened in 5 years' time that I think it makes this long-term strategic planning difficult, and I think underscores your point that plans themselves have to be extremely flexible. Right, they have to be open to sort of tactical innovations, and that's why maintaining the actual relationships with all these neighbors is so important. So I'll leave it there, and I'd love to hear some of your thoughts on that.
Thank you so much. It's a great conversation. Actually, I think the most interesting thing, because we have a fair amount of time for questions too, is just to kind of let you two talk for a little bit. It'd be great to hear if you have responses to that and a little bit of back and forth, and I'll chime in if I have anything constructive to say. But and then we can open up in sort of 10 or 15 minutes to the audience. But it'd be interesting to hear your reactions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your comments, and I agree and feel very close to many of them. You did raise the issue of Turkey becoming a hub being a platitude, and I fully agree with that. I drafted the report actually myself, so I made a point of using the word hub as many times as I could, and instead I was sort of dancing around it, saying of a center of trade, a center of commerce. That's right. That it was very intentional because I am well aware of the concern with the platitude, and also the more substantive problem of the aversion, the political aversion it creates around. Now the problem is, given all those, that the platitude risk and the political risk, nevertheless, I think there is something to it. Substantively, there is a point to this. Because in natural gas, I think what's happening, I try to visualize these things. We're going from these crisscrossing pipelines to what are, networks with nodes. Mm-hmm. That is very different. And the changing to that new geometry requires thinking about these new nodes, because when you have globally integrated markets, you tend to get these nodes. So the problem is, in our region, will there be nodes? How many will there be? Is Turkey the right place for the nodes? That's a whole set of interesting questions. And, we can discuss that. But I think we do need nodes. So we'll be shifting into that paradigm. Politically, I think, of course, being a Turk and feeling that being a node would have its upside economically, if nothing else, I feel the way to address it politically is to actually think about vertical integration and make the suppliers to that node stakeholders, right, and make Turkey a stakeholder in the upstream assets of some of these players. That is usually when you turn a market from state players like natural gas, Iran, Russia, to market players. That is how things start changing. You get, you chop up these assets, you start trading them, you get multiple stakeholders in these assets, portfolio, investors come in the picture. It's a totally different picture. And I think if Turkey can manage that picture by bringing these supplier nations as stakeholders into the node, I think actually we can do it. I think it would be a very interesting way to organize the natural gas trade around Turkey. And I think if we do get these nodes, as we know from economics, they benefit from increasing returns. So once you get it going, then you have all these nations around us who may be unwilling to get in the global trade of natural gas. And one thinks of Iran as, if you have a well-functioning node close to you, you may be tempted to say, there is a thriving trade possibility there. Is there any way for me to get in the game? So they can become magnets of commercial attention, attraction, and in that sense, I think that would add a lot to the whole natural gas picture. But I do agree, the platitude risk is there, the political risk is there. The question is, how do we deal with those? I think we are doing a good job dealing with the linguistic risk, because I tried not to use it. Okay, I'll stop there.
Yeah, no, that's fine.
I just was reminded of an analogy in similar part of the neighborhood, but sort of further east. I wrote this book about Chinese, Russian, U.S. influence in Central Asia over the last 10 years and its determinants and so forth. And often when I presented it, and especially Turkish audience, I always get the question, what about Turkish influence, right, in the region, and so forth. And I say, Turkey's a really good, again, getting back to the conventions issue, really good example here of evolution on this. That in the early 1990s, I think there was such broad enthusiasm about Turkey that it would become a center of influence in this region, a gateway to this region, a big player in the region, and so forth. And it just, Turkish capabilities, and I think ultimately the interests of these states didn't match up at the time. Turkey underdelivered. It I think, overestimated its own soft power. Now I would argue Turkey actually does have genuine influence in the neighborhood, in part because it's dropped the geopolitical rhetoric. That it's actually not labeling itself as, this sort of top-flight competitive player, and instead it's focusing on the air links, the construction sectors, medium-sized businesses throughout, partnerships. All of this, again, is adding up to a fabric of real connections, and I would argue real value in the relationships. And I wonder if sort of dropping the geopolitical labeling was almost a prerequisite to doing that. Anyway.
Probably. I think that's actually a great analogy. And I think that is exactly what should be done in this hub or whatever trading center idea, that we should forget about the geopolitics of it. It is a commercial proposition for all of us, for all the countries there. And if we can shift it to that with all the mechanisms and institutions that would underpin it, I think it can happen. Yeah. But you're absolutely right. I think the geopolitical discourse is contaminating it.
So can you say more about that when you talk about the barriers, like what's going to stand in the way of that commercial proposition happening, of the investments necessary to create the hub you're talking about?
It really is a whole sort of mindset. I mean, one of the recommendations in the report is actually precisely on this, that we need to start thinking about the roadmap, step by step, of how to create the commercial foreseeability, the legal foreseeability, the infrastructure investments. Obviously, if you are really turning it into a hub, you need to have all the crisscrossing pipes, and you need to have the storage. You need to have all the financial institution infrastructure that can sustain all the forwards and futures and the derivatives that turn around the trade there. So it's a whole infrastructure, both physical and intellectual institutional infrastructure, that needs to be in place, together with a very sound legal system that can attract the global players. But I think it's step by step, because in these nodes and hubs ideas, again, we know you need the critical mass, the threshold, before it can start growing as a center. So I think our problem so far has been that we are so fortunate to have so many sources, suppliers around us, but with each one of them, there is a problem of a different sort, and we just can't get the critical mass where it can start sort of bootstrapping around that. And we may just be getting there with the developments in Iraq. It may be happening, and the Azeri gas again sort of mobilizing. It just it may be getting to the point where it actually becomes feasible.
So can you talk about how you think Turkey will respond to the pipeline from the Kurdish region of Iraq, which is not just a commercial proposition, obviously it's a heavily political one as well, and how Turkey will react and deal with the central government?
Interesting thing is, I feel now we are, if you asked me this question a month ago, it was different. Now it seems the discussions have changed. The Minister of Foreign Affairs has visited, and the Prime Minister may. So the relations with the central government in Iraq are improving. I mean, we did go through a very tense time. So that is the good context. Now, of course, getting the KRG oil to the existing pipeline, connecting it to it, is the current proposition. So it's not actually the current project is not a direct line from KRG to Turkey, but it's via the existing one. So that, I think, in itself requires mutual trust between KRG and Baghdad for that to go forward. So I'm assuming that there is sort of an impulse, because they will use the pipeline, and you make an investment and you rely on the other. The other one, which is targeted for 2016 for heavier oil, that is a different story. That seems to be a separate pipeline that will go directly, and people are talking about a million barrels a day, which is very significant, I think. That, I think, again, what will determine it is, of course, the next few years. Now, this morning, again, as I was cramming, I realized, for the first time, I read a piece saying that maybe the U.S. will facilitate this process by providing an escrow account, basically, where the payment for this, the KRG oil, will be, in some U.S. trusted U.S. escrow account, after which it'll be divided 17%, 83%. That is the problem, how to divide this resource. And if that happens, that may be the solution. But the feeling I'm getting, just a basic line, is a month ago, it looked very complex. Now I think all the parties realize that they have some benefit in this. So I'm feeling the forces are being aligned to go ahead.
And what's just so I know, what's the timing if you're right, and when?
It's very close. The current one, linking to the current one, is 2014. But I think the capacity, the flow expected there is around 400K. Some do say higher, but I think that 400K is what's being talked about.
Yeah.
And that's 2014, early 2014. The other one is, as I said, 2016, December.
One other question, then we'll open it up. So from what you've been observing of the optimism for a deal with Iran and then the falling apart of a deal with Iran and how the French responded and other things, can you talk about how you perceive that from where you were sitting and what you think the outlook is for some sort of ability for Iranian energy to come back into the market?
That's a tough one because I'm so confused about that. You know, I think I decide that this is the rational thing. It is going in one direction, and then I get into these meetings with very bright, interesting, informed people. Then I change my mind. So I am confused. I really have a hard time saying anything, even suggestive or let alone conclusive. Suggestive. I mean, it seems the sanctions have made an impact. I mean, that is the feeling we're getting. Just a few weeks ago, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Iran was in Turkey. They had this joint event with our minister. And the tone I sensed was positive and constructive. But then you hear people say that Iranians are so good at this art of playing for time that, at some point you'll realize that it won't work. So I'm confused. I mean, Turkey's position is very clear. Obviously, we do want Iran to this dilemma, this tension, to be sort of resolved as soon as possible in the most constructive structure as possible, so that we do our trade more comfortably, and we get rid of this hanging threat of a strike against Iran in the region. It will be a disaster. So Turkey's position is very clear. I mean, everybody says there are rivalries, so on and so forth, but not here. No, I do think Turkey would welcome Iranian issue to be resolved as soon as possible. In terms of the viability of that, the picture seems the sanctions have made an impact. The Iranians are taking a step. Whether that will be concluded, again, I'm not that well versed in Iranian diplomatic tactics to tell you. I don't know. I really don't know.
We have about a half hour, and we have several questions here already. So let's just open it up. We'll start here and then just go straight across.
My name is David Kashin with the International Business Times. You had mentioned it briefly in your talk, but could you maybe just go into a little bit more about and getting into the geopolitical implications of natural gas finds in Israel and how that could affect relations between Turkey and Israel and the tensions between Turkey and Cyprus? Just maybe in general, an overview of it.
One at a time.
Do you want to? It's related to that? Is it one of those?
No, I know the answer to the question.
Oh my God! I would be delighted to hear it.
Yeah, me too.
Sure, go ahead. You want to introduce yourselves?
Sure. I'm Gligor Taskovich, a former minister for foreign investment in the Republic of Macedonia. And I was actually involved peripherally on this issue that you just raised. As you know, there were some problems between Turkey and Israel over the last couple of years over their bilateral relations. And we actually tried between February and June, to get a meeting with the principals of the offshore gas fields offshore of Israel with Turkish ministers and the prime minister. And we were rebuffed at all levels because the relations between Turkey and Israel hadn't yet been resolved. This resolution came about, as I understand it, from Secretary Kerry's visit to Ankara in maybe March, was it? April? But that was sort of the beginning of the resolution. But the objective was that the offshore gas fields in Israel did, in fact, and probably still do, in fact, want to build a pipeline for their gas to Turkey.
Okay. Yeah. Now, the first thing is, of course, after the Marmara, there have, thanks to President Obama's intervention, there was an apology. So things have changed. That was, that is obviously a positive move. We did wish that the exchange of ambassadors would take place as soon as, or shortly after that. That hasn't happened yet, which is unfortunate. Hopefully it will. And the compensation discussions are not concluded. That is a sticking issue that still continues. So given, of course, the severity of the Marmara event and the deep impact it has had on the Turkish psyche and the political scene, I think, it will take time for it to sort of fade away or, just at least to be absorbed in the political system. So that's natural. Given that, so there is that force sort of hopefully with a half-life, just basically we're absorbing it. Then there is the hope of this new resource, which should, in normal times, bring all the players to work together. At least Israel and Turkey. The Cyprus issue is a totally other complex issue, although, this could provide an opportunity. Because when you look at the alternatives, what is being talked about is like a floating, liquidation, a liquidation plant, LNG plant, or connecting to Crete, a pipeline to Crete and then to Greece, or electricity generation and then having these cables under the Mediterranean. These are all very, very expensive alternatives. So it seems economically the rational solution is to go through Turkey. If that is the case, one hopes, I don't know what political science says about this, but one hopes that the actors at some point rationally reach the sort of this rational equilibrium. And, whether it takes some time, whether there's a lot of posturing in between, I don't know. I mean, probably there will be. But, one hopes as the effect of the Marmara gradually is absorbed, and God forbid we don't have anything like it again, so that's just a dying away problem. And then the prospect of this rational equilibrium, I'm hoping that we will get there. We will actually, given time, we will get to the point where at least the Israeli-Turkish rational calculations will end up directing it to Turkey. In terms of putting numbers on it, this is also very important because I think, I usually try not to use numbers in speeches because I think they can distract. But the volume, if I remember correctly, is around 40 trillion BCF in the East Med. Now, you look at Iraq natural gas, that is in the order of hundreds plus. You look at the Caspian, just the Caspian Sea and around it, it's double that in the 200s. So in terms of order of magnitude, this is a great resource. I mean, there's no doubt about it. But nevertheless, within a bigger picture, we need to sort of calibrate how important it is. It's very important, but again, there are so many other important resources and it should be considered within that broader context. Thank you.
We never see geopolitics preventing the optimal economic transaction from happening. That's why the Saudis burn nearly 1 million barrels a day in their power sector instead of taking gas from Qatar. Yeah, please.
Thank you so much. It was an excellent, excellent presentation by both and very energizing indeed. I have a question with regard to U.S. and China. You mentioned the similarities. I'd like to ask you to opine on the differences. China, like India, is increasing dramatically in its energy consumption as they industrialize. The United States is declining in its energy consumption, perhaps not as fast as China is increasing. U.S. is increasing its energy production, China not so much. What do you see as a paradigm for the future if the U.S. and Canada, certainly, they're talking about, with all the debate going on with Keystone in the United States, taking their, I can't call them, oil sands. We're not allowed to use the word that was in my head. So the oil sands down to the Gulf Coast and then out to China as well. So what do you see as a future paradigm if the United States and Canada were exporting to China and India and that part of the world? And how, if at all, would Turkey be involved in that mix?
First, I need to clarify myself, because when I drew the parallel I was drawing was really at the sort of level of the two countries' sort of aspiration to have some sort of self-sufficiency. So apart from that, very different stories for very different reasons, very different strategies. So, then let me clarify that. I think if that were to happen, if indeed resources, oil, were to go from North America to Asia, I think that would actually address and eliminate my concern about global oil markets fragmenting. So I would welcome that. And I think Turkey would welcome that. As I said, if you are a fossil fuel dependent country and you are dependent on imports, your best bet is globally functioning markets, and that is our position. So given that, basic paradigm, basic strategy, any trend, any shift in the global markets that contributes to the integration of various geographies would be ideal. With that would be ideal. So I hope it happens. I don't know, probably Jason would know more whether of the viability of North American oil and possibly gas at some point going in the direction of Asia. So yes, we would welcome that. That would be a very good development, actually. Very feasible.
We're still importing about 7.5 million barrels a day, so we have to back a lot of stuff out before we start exporting large amounts. Well, being a net exporter, we may export some and import others. But just to ask on that, can you say more, unlike natural gas, which is really costly and difficult to move around the world, oil is not. And so we see price disconnects happen because there's a policy issue like a crude export restriction or the Jones Act or pipeline constraints, and so you see these $10 or $15 or $20 discounts happen around the world. And those tend to resolve themselves over time as new infrastructure comes to market, maybe. So what's your concern when you talk about fragmentation of the world oil market, given how easy it is to take a tanker from one place to another and send it in a different direction? And we're taking almost no oil from Nigeria right now, but Nigerian oil exports are not down very much. They're just sending it somewhere else. So what's the scenario in which you see the oil market fragmenting?
It's, as I said, it's a far-fetched scenario. I mean, that is a given. But when you look at the reflection, the crystallization, the implementation of the Chinese concern, for example, you start seeing the Chinese focus on land access to these resources, to Kazakhstan. I mean, that in itself, one wonders whether it would happen under any circumstances or it's just a reflection of that concern. Or the talk about the Myanmar pipeline, or the talk about Chinese being very concerned about seaways for accessing its oil. So that whole mindset, it seems, if you carry it to the extreme from the Chinese perspective, it seems China would feel much more secure if it actually locked in, both in terms of possibly ownership, in terms of access infrastructure, in terms of security control in its near region, then that would be, it feels like China would feel much happier and much more secure in terms of its energy supply. And it seems it's a consideration. So that would basically take that part of the world and focus it on China. The mechanisms, as I said, can be various. It can be physical, it can be contractual, it can be investment-wise, but that could happen. Again, far-fetched, could happen. And then, of course, on this side, these things could feed off each other. And if the U.S. were to start saying, I don't want to really deal that much with the Middle Eastern problems, again, that's various other problems. But let me push the Europeans to focus more about the Middle East. Then just tactically, it may be, just wiser for the U.S. to say, I can get my oil from my region. So why don't you focus on this region a bit more? And when you combine all these dynamics, my concern is that at some point it can become a reality. So that is the concern, but it's a 20-year concern, definitely not 5, definitely not 10. As I understand, 40 years ago, actually, we didn't have these oil markets so well integrated. It was with the transportation technologies we got here. So I hope politics doesn't reverse that.
There were 4 questions over here, and that should take us close to the end.
Mohammed Darwaza, Medley Global Advisors. Thank you for a great talk. Maybe start off just going back to the issue of the KRG and sort of the KRG in Iraq, and just sort of relating it to what you were saying about nodes and part of the system and bringing over stakeholders and essentially this is what Turkey's doing. The KRG needs Turkey, but at the same time they're building this partnership that's supposed to last for a while. But then you also made a point about stripping out the geopolitics of all this. This is in line with Turkey's zero problem with neighbors and all that, but essentially the same cannot be said about the Iraqis. yes, you're seeing this detente between Maliki and Barzani, but I think a big part of that has to do with the run-up to elections in April and the need for Maliki to bring in some of the support, which he's lost throughout this year. So I guess my question to you is, beyond the elections, when sort of nationalist fervor comes back into Iraq, talk of Kurdish aspirations, which essentially energy independence is the first step for any aspiring Kurdish state. I mean, what would Turkey's, reaction would be to all this, and how would, what's the current sort of policy thinking with this sense? I mean, is there a contingency plan? It's easy to say, okay, they don't want to upset Baghdad, but there is members of that cabinet, that government, we've seen it with Shahristani very clearly, that, may not be able to let this go. So,
No, fair. I mean, as much as we want this to be an economic, commercial debate approach, in the Middle East it never is. I mean, geopolitics is always there. So you can hope that the geopolitics will at least take a second, will play second fiddle and hopefully then go even further down. It's a process. It's not going to happen overnight. So it's a matter of managing it, basically phasing out to the extent possible the geopolitical distortions as you focus on the economic dimension to it. You look at Iraq, the Iraqi central government does need oil revenues. There's no, we know the infrastructure problems in Iraq, and we know how dependent the central government budget is on oil revenues. So in that sense, fundamentally, they're economic and political, because as a politician, you really do need the funds to deliver to your people. So the interests are aligned. So that, I think, is at least my optimistic reading of the context. Again, posturing and everything will take time, but eventually the economic forces and benefits seem too strong for these parties to disagree and, make it impossible for the oil, the KRG oil or Iraqi oil to flow through Turkey. That it has to happen. They need it. We need it as well. That's all. We need the supply. They need to deliver. That works. Now, the contingency plan, that's more problematic. And because what happens is, if after the elections, Maliki government does change tune, which I think, and I hope it won't, it's not only energy for Turkey. The Baghdadi, the central Iraq government relation with Turkey is not only about energy. We have this burning Syrian problem. And, working with the Iraqis is important. So I think it will be very moderate. If Maliki were to say, I'm out of the deal, I don't allow any oil to flow, I still think, given the other burning issues, the Turkish response will be more moderate. Okay.
So, I think there's a nuance here in geopolitics after I've just pasted my colleagues for thinking everything in terms of geopolitics. I think on the one hand, geopolitics is about power projection, distributional concerns, about relative gains, right, from different institutions and agreements. But I think what you're referring to here are status concerns. I think that's a different political animal when we talk about sovereign status. And I think the tricky thing in a lot of these Turkish relationships is less to do with geopolitical gains and more to do with status considerations, right? When you look at obviously concerns over the KRG going independent, if you think about the Armenian, Azerbaijan, Turkish triangular diplomatic mishap, if you want to frame it that way. And if you think about the Cyprus issue, these are all fundamental territorial sovereign questions. And yes, there may be rational solutions, and I'm all in favor, wrote a book on this, of sort of hybrid sovereign solutions in some of these cases, but the problem is domestic publics don't want hybrid sovereignty, they want complete sovereignty. And so I guess that would be my other question to you. You consciously avoided Cyprus, and perhaps looking into your crystal ball, can there be any kind of institutional arrangement without a status settlement? Is it possible to even envisage something along those lines, or is it just too difficult and messy?
I think it's too difficult and messy. I've been hearing, I've been in these discussions quite many places. I haven't heard anything that sounds realistic. Mm-hmm. No, unfortunately.
And that's on both sides, you think? Or?
Yeah. Pretty much, yeah. Sadly. That was
right here.
No.
green sweater.
Annabelle Libaud, I'm a CPA student. I have actually two questions. My first question is, what is the current state of the relationship between the EU and Turkey on energy policy issues? And I mean, maybe focusing on the most prevalent one, I mean, the one that is really on the agenda at the moment. And the second question is regarding the renewable energy. My question here is, if you were to choose, say, two type of renewable energy for Turkey to develop in the coming years, what would be these two energy sources? Thank you.
The first one, I mean, unfortunately, I think it's somewhat falling victim to the broader context, because I mean, this is one area where it's quite obvious that EU and the Turkey can, need, should work together. And we do have, I mean, you know, the whole TANAP process is a part of it. The whole the Southern Corridor is a part of it. But one would hope that it would be more of an integration where we actually do become part of the European energy network, and that would make, you know, Turkish life much easier. The whole flexibility arguments, the whole the distortionary problems, many of them would abate. So it would be wonderful. But again, given the broad European EU-Turkey context, unfortunately, I don't think we are getting as much out of it as we should. Having said all that, things are progressing. And I think the TANAP process is, you know, is a very important development in this whole thing. And I think, again, this morning, this is the news, starting 2014, hopefully, the TANAP construction will begin. So, and that will at least provide some more sort of resources from Azerbaijan to Europe, and Turkey obviously is an integral part of that. So bit by bit, step by step, I think Turkey is doing what it can to help with European energy security. And I think our European partners are well aware of it. Now, in terms of renewables, the onshore wind is the only one, as far as I know, that is, you know, really competitive, you know, arguably competitive if you find the right locations. So that's the one that we are scaling up, we are investing in, and there are quite a few parts of Turkey where the wind profile seems to be good, and it's happening, and it should happen more. I don't really know a second one that I would say. I'm unwilling to say solar at this stage. I mean, again, you know, we do seem to have the resource. We have quite a few intense sunny locations in the country, but I don't think the technology is at a point where I would feel comfortable saying, let's scale up, this is it. So I would say onshore is what should be done and what is being done. Having said that, still the overall percentage is very small. I mean, we should, but I don't think it will address any of the main challenges I addressed for some time.
In the purple.
I'm Liz Wishnick from the Weatherhead East Asian Institute and Montclair State University. My question is about China, going back to what you said about China's focus on land access and ownership contributing to fragmentation. But in the Chinese viewpoint, they see their acquisitions more in the sense of creating regional networks. And they're doing this right in Turkey's neighborhood in Central Asia and with Russia, although so far just with oil, not yet with gas. I wonder how the thinking is in Turkey about this. Is there some talk of this as an opportunity for Turkey in terms of its long-term strategy of becoming some kind of a node in energy networks, or is China seen more as a competitor because of the nature, the types of countries that it's involved with at present?
Do you mean the Chinese involvement in the Middle East or the broader Chinese?
The Chinese involvement in Central Asia and with Russia. Does Turkey see any opportunity of becoming involved in any of these extended networks? Can China be, even though they compete in terms of access to sources, is there any opportunity for engagement or parallel connections with China?
I mean, really, again, I'm sort of sifting through the various readings, conversations. Nothing comes to my mind that would suggest that there is anything substantive on that front, looking at the Chinese energy outlook and engagement as potentially sort of a networking possibility for Turkey. That is not to say those possibilities do not exist, or that is not to say that the ministries are talking about this. I don't know. I simply am not aware of it. But I mean, as you said, probably because of the competition for Central Asian resources, at the moment it's more of a zero sum rather than sort of a win-win network framework that, one looks at China. But I would need to really think about how we can formulate it to make it different nodes in a network that cooperate, that benefit, a win-win framework. I haven't heard anything. I should confess I haven't thought about it enough. I will.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think so. Liz, my thinking on some of this, but I think this is a real inflection point in terms of China's role in the Caspian and also in Central Asia. And I think the critical development here is this connector that CNPC is building in Turkmenistan that was meant to be, originally drawn up, supposed to take Eastern Turkmen gas out west to a Trans-Caspian node. Now, why in the world CNPC would be building something that would go east-west is really beyond anyone's sort of reasoning. In all probability, they're going to change the direction of the pipeline. And if that happens, then I think it is zero-sum. Then I think China does not have an incentive independently to see Turkmen gas go to Turkey. It needs that 65 BCM. It considers Turkmen gas to be its. And so I think this is not spoken. You see very little on this. But what are the rational incentives that China has to see a Trans-Caspian connection to that part of Central Asia realized? I would say they're very low at the moment. But beyond that, the Turkish-Chinese relationship is really interesting. It was at rock bottom in 2009 when Erdogan said that events in Xinjiang constituted a genocide. Very quickly, as the Chinese do, they sort of sent delegations, smoothed things over, and now the relationship in other parts is very strong, to the point at which this missile defense business, where Erdogan accepted the bid from a Chinese contractor, again, in violation of NATO rules. That's a big deal. The invocation of the SCO as an alternative to the EU, all this kind of stuff. I don't think that part's serious. I think that's just to sort of leverage and throw out to the EU. We don't have to kowtow to EU. We have other options. I'm not really sure anyone really knows what the SCO does. Not even really in the SCO do they know what they do. But on the energy front specifically, we don't know, and I think this is a time where this might actually be realigned and redefined.
And not just gas. I think on the oil side, China is increasingly concerned with security of supply as it grows more reliant on the Middle East, which helps explain the 1 million barrel a day deal they just did with Russia, I think, in part. Last question in the red. Did you have your hand up in the red jacket? No?
Yeah, it was partially answered. I didn't want to be redundant, but talking about gas, for instance, LNG, there was an article in one of the papers recently about Louisiana, and LNG production and how it has tremendous potential. But, when talking in terms of short-term versus long-term, they say it's going to take quite a while. And like you said, it's an expensive proposition, first of all. And getting back to the oil situation, there was a conference recently on EM capital markets, and they focused on Kazakhstan, Georgia, Ukraine, Azerbaijan, and Armenia. And they talked about capital in these various countries. Talk about Azerbaijan state oil and Eurobonds. And Eurobonds are prevalent in a few of the other countries also. And you kind of talked about it, so I didn't know if it was important to talk about it. But you said starting today, the Azerbaijan-Euro connection is becoming stronger. I was just wondering if
I'll elaborate on that
a little bit.
Okay. Well, basically, what I was just trying to say, our Turkish Prime Minister and the Azeri President had a meeting, and they said TANAP. I mean, we had already agreed on it. TANAP this is Turkish Prime Minister Erdogan and the Azeri President Aliyev. They just had a joint press conference, And they've announced that it'll be effective 2014, January, I think early 2014, that the work will start on TANAP, which will, the project, that the Azeri Shah Deniz 2 will go via Turkey and will connect then to Italy. And it's a 16B.
Is that Nabucco?
No. Nabucco is dead. They killed Nabucco. Nabucco first became Nabucco West. Now they killed it. So now it's tapped. So it's instead of going up, it's going down to Italy. But still, it's at least joining the European pool.
There is something. Is it a pipeline? Or
Yes.
Oil or is it oil?
No, gas. We're talking gas.
But it lives on in the form of a wonderful opera. So
Yeah, exactly.
dead as a heart, which is where the name came from originally. Cheniere will be exporting LNG from Louisiana in 2015. That project is happening, and there'll be at least a few more, I think. Good. Well, this was excellent. Really interesting discussion. I learned a lot. Thanks to Memduh, and thanks, Professor Cooley, for being here. Thanks to all of you.
Thank you.